The generator in the milk house died at 4:30 in the morning with a barn full of 40 cows that had not been milked in 18 hours and were groaning against their stanchions with the pain of it, their bags swollen tight and hot in the dark. Every man in Cobble Hollow had said a woman shaped like her had no business trying to run a dairy that a strong young farmer had already walked away from. Nora Halvorsen did not stop to argue the point. She went out across the frozen yard with a lantern in her teeth and a pipe wrench in her fist, dropped down beside the dead engine in her nightgown and her husband's old barn coat, led the frozen fuel line, cracked the injector, and got that old diesel hammering again before a single cow could bag up into the fever that kills them. She was 35 years old, wide through the shoulder and heavy through the hip, and there was not one soul in that valley who had ever bet a nickel on her doing anything harder than pouring coffee at the church supper. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the very last word, and drop the name of your town in the comments below, because I want to see just how far Nora's story travels tonight. By the middle of June, the same men who had shaken their heads at the feed mill would be leaning on her fence rail with their caps in their hands, watching a bulk truck back up to a milk house everyone had sworn was finished, drawing off the sweetest tank of milk hauled out of that township in a dozen years. Nobody in Cobble Hollow knew that yet, least of all the man who had given the herd away. It began, the way most things in that town began, at the counter of the feed mill on a raw afternoon at the tail end of March, with the last gray snow rotting in the ditches, and the sky the color of skimmed milk. Nora was sacking up laying pellets by the loading door, and she was quick at it, the same steady hands that could ease a calf out of a heifer in trouble or find a splinter in a child's heel by feel alone, when Roy Tibbet came stamping in off the step and told Halbert Ames the news like he was calling a horse race. The Delcourt Dairy was through. Young Merritt Vane had sat down Tuesday night with a loan officer from the county bank, and the milk check would not cover the feed bill one more month, and come the 1st of April the oldest working dairy on Wren Creek would go dark for the first time since before the paved road came through. The bank wanted the ground for the frontage. Everybody knew the parlor and the stanchion barn would sit and rot, and the herd would go for beef prices at the sale barn in Merrow, 40 good cows scattered to the killers because a young man with a strong back had run out of the one thing a dairy eats faster than hay, which is money. And everybody agreed, blowing on their coffee, that it was a pity and that nothing could be done. A broke dairy was a broke dairy. Milk waits for no man. Nora set the last sack on the pallet and stood very still with her back to the register. She had learned a long time ago that a big woman who kept her mouth shut could hear everything worth hearing in Cobble Hollow, because people talked in front of her the same way they talked in front of the grain bins, as if she were furniture that happened to breathe. She heard Roy Tibbet say the size of the debt. She heard him say the name of the bank. And she heard him say, half laughing, not unkindly, the very sentence she had been hearing in one shape or another her whole life, only this time it was said about a herd of cows instead of about her. Some things are just too far gone to save. Nora had grown up in that barn. Not owned it, never that. The Halvorsens had never owned anything but a frame house and a garden and a set of milking tools that hung clean on their pegs every night of the year. Her grandmother, Ada Halvorsen, had been the herdswoman on the Delcourt Dairy for 39 years, hired the same spring the creamery in town first ran a night shift. And from the time Nora could hold a rag she had spent every morning and every evening of her girlhood out in that stanchion barn. A wide, solemn little girl on an upturned bucket, watching a woman built like a chest of drawers strip out the last milk from a cow's back quarters by the light of one bare bulb. It was Ada who taught her that a cow gives her milk down out of trust and not out of fear, which is why a beaten cow holds up and a gentle cow lets go, and why the loud men who cursed and kicked in the parlor were the very ones whose herds always came up short in the tank. It was Ada who taught her to read a cow the way other people read a face, to know from the set of an ear and the flick of a tail and the smell of a breath whether a cow was starting a fever or coming into her milk, or simply lonesome for the one stanchion she thought of as home. It was Ada who put Nora's small hand flat against a warm flank and taught her to feel a cud come up, to count the 4 beats of a healthy rumen against her palm the way you would feel for a pulse, and told her that a cow chewing her cud is a cow telling you she trusts the world enough to stop watching it. And it was Ada who stood with her one bitter February morning in the alley behind the cows and told her the whole truth of the trade in one breath, that the milk is only the money and the cow is the farm, and a dairy that forgets the difference will bleed to death with a full tank. She had been gone for years now. She had left Nora $9,000 in a passbook account, a wooden caddy of hand tools worn smooth as river stones, and the habit of coming awake at 4 in the morning whether the cows needed her or not. The town had put Ada in the ground with real respect, and then, with the soft cruelty that small places keep for their own, had gone straight back to seeing her granddaughter as precisely what she looked to be. A heavy-set, quiet woman who sacked feed in the off-season and pulled milking relief on other men's farms when they were short-handed, who slipped a candy to a crying child at the counter when nobody was watching, who wept at the Memorial Day flags on the bridge, and who was, by the long-settled judgment of Cobble Hollow, too gentle for hard business and too big for hard work. Nobody had ever quite said the second half of that to her face. They said it the other way with a glance when she climbed up onto a feed wagon and the springs sighed under her. As for the Delcourt Dairy, the whole town had been telling that story all winter, and Nora had heard every version of it across the counter. It had started, everyone agreed, 3 winters back, when old Emile Delcourt, who had milked that herd for half a century, took a stroke in the parlor one December morning and was found by his nephew slumped against a cow that had stood stock still and would not move a hoof off him. Emile lived another 11 days in the county hospital and then let go, and because he had no children the whole of it, barn and herd and 40 acres of hill pasture along Wren Creek fell to that nephew, Merritt Vane, who had come home from a construction job 3 states away to bury an uncle he barely knew and had found himself, at 36, holding the lead ropes to 40 cows he did not understand. He was not a lazy man. Nobody in Cobble Hollow ever said that of him, and Nora, who watched people for a living, would not have let them. Merritt Vane worked like a man trying to outrun a fire. He was tall and raw-boned, with sandy hair going early to gray at the temples and a pair of tired blue eyes that had seen too much red ink, and he was up before light and down long after dark, and none of it was enough, because he was trying to run a living animal like a job site, on schedule and by force. And the herd was dying in 100 small ways he could not see. The milk check had been falling for 2 years. First it was the count, cows drying up early and coming back thin. Then it was the quality. The tank docked month after month. For a sale count the creamery man read off his clipboard with a frown mastitis running through the string like a slow fire nobody could find the source of. 2 good cows had gone down with milk fever in the fall, and Merritt had lost them both because he did not know to look for the cold ears and the kink in the neck until they were already flat and cooling. He had wormed on a calendar instead of on need, fed by the book instead of by the cow, and hauled in a nutritionist from the co-op who sold him a grain ration that looked fine on paper and soured half the herd's stomachs by spring. By February, the vet bills and the feed bills between them ate the whole check and then some. And the bank, which had carried Emile Delcourt on a handshake for 40 years, looked at the young man's ledger and saw only a hole, and told him gently that it was time to be reasonable. And Merritt Vane, who was proud and tired and out of his depth and had begun to hate the smell of the barn, had agreed. That was the story Cobble Hollow told, and the town told it kindly, the way you speak of a good man beaten by circumstance, and everyone agreed that it was nobody's fault and that the herd would just have to go. What the town did not know, because the town had never once thought to ask a heavy-set produce clerk her opinion on a herd of cows, was that Nora Halvorsen had been reading the Delcourt Dairy from the outside for 3 years the way her grandmother had taught her to read a cow, from the set of its ears and the smell of its breath, and knew exactly what was killing it. She had pulled 2 weeks of milking relief on that farm the winter Merritt first came home, before he learned to distrust her. And she had walked that stanchion barn once and known within an hour what 40 cows were trying to tell anybody who would listen. She had seen the vacuum on the milking machine set 15 points too high so that it stripped the teat ends raw and left the door open for every germ in the barn. She had seen the liners on the milking units cracked and hard, kept in service 2 seasons past their life because a new set cost money, spreading infection cow to cow like a shared cup. She had seen cows milked in the wrong order, the sick left in the string ahead of the sound, so that the machine carried the bad quarters trouble straight into clean udders down the line. She had seen the bedding thin and the alley wet and the water cups scaled shut so that half the herd could not drink their fill, and a cow that cannot drink cannot make milk. It is that simple. And she had seen, most of all, that the cows were afraid, that they braced and held up their milk when a man came down the alley fast, that they had learned the barn was a place where hands were rough and voices were loud and the machine hurt, and that they were giving Merritt Vane exactly what he had taught them to give, which was as little as they could and still be let out to the yard. None of it was past saving. That was the thing that had kept Nora awake for a week of 4 in the morning risings while the town buried the dairy in its talk. Every single fault on that farm was a thing her grandmother had shown her how to fix with patience and clean water and a set hand, and not one of them was the kind of ruin that could not be undone. The cows were not old. The barn was sound. The ground along Wren Creek was the best grass in the township, spring-fed and never plowed, the kind of pasture that had made the Delcourt name back when butter was money. What was broke was not the dairy. What was broke was the knowing, and Nora Halvorsen had spent her whole overlooked life carrying the exact knowing that farm was starving for in her hands and in her memory. Like a coin in her pocket, she had never once been given a reason to spend. So she stood at the feed mill counter that gray afternoon with her back to the register and Roy Tibbetts' laugh in her ears. And she did the arithmetic she had been doing in her head for a week without letting herself finish it. $9,000 in the passbook. A truck that ran. A grandmother's tools. 35 years of a strong back she had never been allowed to use for anything but lifting other people's freight. And a herd of 40 cows, worth beef money at the sale barn in Merrow and worth a living to anyone who knew how to listen to them, about to go under the gavel for the price of their hides. She turned around from the shelf. Halbert Ames looked up, and Roy Tibbett looked up, and for one moment the 2 men wore the mild, patient, faintly amused expression that Cobble Hollow always put on when the big Halvorsen woman was about to say something, the look you give a child who has raised her hand. Nora asked, in her low, even voice, what Merritt Vane wanted for the herd. There was a silence in the feed mill, the exact shape and size of a held breath. Then Roy Tibbett laughed, because he did not know what else to do, and Halbert Ames said, careful and slow, the way you talk a person down off a foolish ledge, that she surely could not be thinking what it sounded like she was thinking. And Nora Halvorsen, who had spent her whole life being told what she could not be thinking, buttoned her coat over the sacking apron, picked her keys up off the counter, and said that she guessed she would go on out to the Delcourt place and ask the man herself. The Delcourt place sat 2 miles out the Wren Creek Road, where the valley pinched down between 2 wooded hills and the creek ran close along the fence line, and Nora had not driven out to it on purpose in 4 years. Not since the last morning she had helped her grandmother milk before Ada's hands gave out for good. She drove out slow that afternoon, with the heater ticking and the wipers pushing at a thin cold rain, and when she came around the last bend and the farm opened up in front of her, her chest went tight in a way she had not expected. The barn was still beautiful. That was the word, and Nora did not care that men did not use it for barns, because it was the true one. It was a long, low stanchion barn of fieldstone and weathered board, with a gambrel roof and a row of small square windows down the south wall going gold in the wet light, and a stone milkhouse tucked against its near end, and behind it the hill pasture ran up green even this early, spring water keeping it ahead of the season the way it always had. and it was dying on its feet. She could see that, too, with the eye Ada had given her. The yard was a churn of mud where the cows stood too long, waiting to be let in. The manure pile had crept up against the barn wall where no clean farm would let it sit. A barn window was patched with cardboard, and the milkhouse door hung on a dropped hinge, and there was a dead look to the whole place, a slump, the look a cow gets in the eye a day before she goes down when the animal has decided the fight is not worth the finishing. Nora sat in the truck for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Then she got out and knocked on the house door, and when nobody came, she followed the sound of a running vacuum pump down to the barn and let herself in through the milkhouse into the warm, sour dark, and stood in the alley behind 40 cows and let the smell of them tell her everything the town had gotten wrong. Merritt Vane was at the far end, hanging a milking unit on a cow that shifted and stamped and would not stand for him, and he was tired in a way that went past his body, and when he looked up and saw the big Halvorsen woman standing in his alley in the half-dark, he did not even have the strength to be surprised. He knew her a little, the way everyone knew her a little. He asked her, not rude, only empty, what she needed, and Nora, who had planned a dozen careful ways to say it on the drive out and thrown every one of them away the moment she smelled the barn, said the plain thing. She said she had heard he was selling the herd. She said she wanted to buy it. She said she wanted to buy the herd and rent the barn and the parlor and the hill pasture from him and run the dairy herself, and pay him a fair share out of the milk check every month so that he could clear his debt without scattering 40 good cows to the killers and keep the ground and walk away clean if he still wanted to walk. She said it all in her low, even voice, with her hands quiet at her sides, and she watched Merritt Vane's face while she said it, and she saw exactly what she had known she would see. She saw a man who had spent 3 years being beaten by a thing he could not understand look at a heavy-set produce clerk offering to take that thing off his hands, and she saw him decide, in the space of one breath, that she was either a fool or a joke, and that either way he did not have the heart left to laugh. He set the milking unit down. He wiped his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his hands. And then, because he was a decent man even at the end of his rope, he did not mock her. He told her the truth instead, which was in its own way worse. He told her the herd had a cell count so high the creamery had put him on notice that half the string had had mastitis over the winter, that he had lost 2 cows to milk fever and a third to a twisted gut, that the bulk tank cooler was on its last legs and the milking machine older than she was, and that he had personally worked that herd 16 hours a day for 3 years and could not make it pay, and that a woman who had never run so much as a chicken coop of her own was not going to walk in off the road and do in a season what he had failed to do in 3 years, and that the kindest thing he could tell her was to go on home. Nora let him finish. She had a great deal of practice at letting men finish, and when he was done she did not argue with a single word of it, because every word of it was true, and she had learned from Ada that you never win a person by telling them they are wrong about the thing that has been breaking their heart. Instead, she asked if she could look at a cow. Merritt Vane, who had expected an argument and gotten a request, was too worn out to say no. He waved a hand down the string as if to say, "Look all you like. It will not help you." And Nora Halvorsen walked down the alley to a black and white cow standing third from the end, a cow whose ears were down and whose flank was hollow and whose eye had that gone-away look, and she did not say a word. She stepped in beside the cow slow, from the front where the animal could see her, and she laid her broad warm hand flat on the cow's neck and left it there. And she leaned her whole weight in gentle against the shoulder the way Ada had taught her, giving the cow her steadiness to lean back into, and she began, in a voice too low for Merritt to hear the words, to talk to her. The cow's ear came around. That was all at first, one ear swinging slow toward the low voice like a compass finding north. Then the cow shifted her weight and leaned back into Nora's shoulder, taking the offered steadiness, and after a moment there was a long, slow working along the animal's jaw as she brought up a cud and began, for the first time in that barn in longer than Merritt Vane could remember, to chew. Nora stood with her hand on the cow and felt the 4 slow beats of the rumen come up warm against her palm, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, the oldest good news in the world, and she looked back down the alley at the tired man watching her, and she did not smile, and she did not gloat. She only said, quiet, that this cow was not sick. This cow was scared and lonesome, and her feet hurt, and she was standing in the wrong end of the string next to a cow that was sick, and none of that was past mending. And then she said the thing that changed Merritt Vane's face, the first crack in 3 years of defeat. She told him the cow's name. She said the cow's name was Juniper, that Emile Delcourt had named her the spring she was born because she came in a hard frost under the juniper by the milk house, and that Nora's own grandmother had dried the calf off with a feed sack that same morning, and that this cow, this exact tired, frightened animal he had been about to load onto a truck to Merrow, was the last daughter of the best cow the Delcourt dairy ever raised. Merritt Vane stood in his own barn and looked at a cow he had owned for 3 years and had never once known the name of, and something in the set of his shoulders came undone. They stood in the barn for 2 hours after that, the tired man and the big, quiet woman going down the string cow by cow while the rain came on harder outside, and Nora named them all, not because she was showing off, but because she could not help it, because Ada had drilled the herd's bloodlines into her the way other grandmothers taught hymns, and because a cow with a name is a cow you cannot quite send to the killers. She showed him the vacuum gauge set too high and explained in plain words what 15 points of extra pull did to a teat and over 1,000 milkings. She showed him the cracked liners and told him what they cost new and what they cost left in service. She showed him the 2 cows that were truly sick, a hard-quartered old girl with a chronic udder that ought to be sold sound for beef before she suffered, and a young cow with a fresh infection that could be cured in 10 days with clean hands and a warm compress, and the patience to milk her out by hand 4 times a day. And she showed him, kneeling in the muck without any care for her coat, the water cup scaled shut with hard water lime, and she worked one open with the point of her grandmother's old jackknife until the fresh water ran, and the cow above it dropped her head and drank and drank and drank, and Merritt Vane watched a cow he had been told was a poor milker drink for 2 straight minutes, and understood, all at once and too late to save his pride, that he had been starving his herd of water in a valley made of springs. By the time the light was gone, he was not arguing any more. He was asking questions. And when Nora finally named her terms again, plain as the first time, he did not tell her to go home. He told her he had to think, and he walked her out to her truck through the rain. And at the door of the cab he stopped her with a hand not quite touching her arm and asked her, with the first real curiosity he had shown, why? Why would a woman with $9,000 and a steady counter job take on a dying herd and a mountain of somebody else's mistakes for beef money and a share of a milk check that might never come? And Nora Halvorsen stood in the rain and the dark and told him the truth, because she had never learned any profitable way to lie. She told him that her grandmother had given the best 39 years of her life to that barn and had died believing the dairy would die with the man she served, and that Nora had stood at the graveside knowing she carried everything Ada knew and having nowhere on earth to put it. No farm of her own, no herd, no one who would trust a fat woman with a living animal, and that she had spent 4 years watching that knowing go to waste in her own hands like milk left to sour in the pail. And she told him that she had been married once, to a good quiet man named Tom, who drove the milk route and thought she hung the moon and had died under a jackknife tanker on the Merrow grade the second winter they were wed, and that she had learned from burying Tom at 26 that you do not get to keep the years you do not spend, and that she was done, plain done, with saving her strength for a day that never came. She said she would rather lose $9,000 trying to bring a barn back to life than keep it safe in a passbook while 40 cows her grandmother had loved went under the gavel. And Merritt Vane, who had come home to bury one stranger and had somehow ended up the ruin of an old man's life work, looked at her for a long moment in the rain and told her to come back in the morning, and they would talk to the bank. The town found out the way the town found out everything, all at once and wrong in the details, and the town laughed. Not cruelly, most of it, but thoroughly. Roy Tibbett told it at the feed mill as the best joke of the spring, the fat produce girl buying Vane's dead herd, and Halbert Ames shook his head and said it was a shame to see a person throw good money after bad, and the men at the Blue Spoon Diner worked it over their pie for a solid week, and more than one of them said, to each other, and not to her, that the herd would be back at the sale barn by August and Nora Halvorson's grandmother's savings with it. The banker, a careful man named Lowell Prine, who had been ready to foreclose, looked at Nora's $9,000 and her spotless credit and her offer to service Merritt's debt out of a share of the milk, and did the only sensible thing a banker can do when a fool offers to take a loss off his books, which is take the fool's money and wish her well. He gave them a 2-year note and a lease and a schedule of payments that would have made a stronger farm sweat, and he told Nora privately, not unkindly, that he hoped she knew she was likely to lose everything, and Nora told him, just as kindly, that she had already lost more than money and was still standing, and signed her name. She moved into the little hired man's cottage at the foot of the Delcourt Lane on the 4th of April. With her grandmother's tools and her own clothes and a coffee can of Tom's spare change she had never been able to spend, and she started at the only place her grandmother had ever let her start, which was with a bucket and a brush and clean water. She did not buy a single new cow. She did not tear anything out. Before she spent $1 on the future, she gave the barn the thing it had been dying without, which was cleaning. And for the first 2 weeks of April, the men who drove the Wren Creek Road slowed down to watch a heavy-set woman do, alone and by hand, the work 3 hired men would have grumbled at. She forked the manure pile back where it belonged and limed the floor of it. She scraped the alleys down to the concrete and bedded the cows deep in clean straw so their tired feet had something soft to stand on for the first time in a year. She soaked and scrubbed every water cup in the barn until the fresh water ran into all 40, and she stood in the alley the first evening they were all clean and watched the whole herd drink at once, 40 heads down, 40 throats working, a sound like rain, and she had to lean on a post for a moment because it was the sound her grandmother had loved best in the world. She pulled the sick old cow out gentle and hauled her to the sale barn sound, for a fair beef price, before she could suffer a hard death, and she came home and did not tell anyone she had cried in the truck the whole way back, because a dairywoman culls with a clear eye and grieves on her own time, and Ada had taught her both halves of that. And she took the young cow with the fresh infection into the box stall by the milk house and made her a bed and milked her out clean by hand 4 times a day, morning and noon and evening and midnight, with a warm compress and a low voice, for 10 days. And on the 11th morning the cow's milk came back sweet and white with no more clots in it, and Nora carried that pail up to the house and set it on Merritt Vane's step before light like a thing she could not say out loud. Merritt Vane had said he would walk away clean, and for about 4 days he tried. Then he found he could not make himself do it. He stood at his kitchen window the first cold mornings of April and watched the big woman he had half pitied out there in the yard before light, doing his uncle's work the way his uncle used to do it, and he came down one dawn in his chore coat, not saying much, and picked up a fork, and stayed. Nora did not make anything of it. She simply handed him the clean end of a job and let him work, and by the 2nd week they had settled into the wordless rhythm of 2 people who both know how a barn ought to run, and it turned out that Merritt Vane, once he was not trying to force a herd like a job site, had good hands and a strong back and a real willingness to learn, and that all he had ever needed was somebody to show him what the cows had been trying to tell him. The other one who came back was Gustav Lindvist. He was a wiry old Swede past 70, with white stubble and pale eyes and hands like knots of oak, and he had milked alongside Ada Halvorsen for 20 of his years and had quit the day Emil took his stroke, saying he would not watch strangers ruin a good herd. He drove into the yard the 3rd week of April in a rusted-out pickup, got out without a word of greeting, walked the length of the clean-bedded barn looking at the water cups and the deep straw and the cows lying down chewing their cud, and then he came and stood in front of Nora and looked her up and down the way he would look at a heifer at a sale, and said, in his flat old country way, that she had her grandmother's hands but not her grandmother's sense, because her grandmother would never have paid good money for Emil Delcourt's mess. And then he took his coat off and hung it on Ada's old peg and asked where she wanted him to start, and that was the whole of Gustav coming back. And it was worth more to Nora than the banknote, because Gustav remembered the herd the way she did, cow by cow and name by name, and between the two of them not a single animal in that barn was a stranger any more. Now they were 3. And the real work began. If you have come with me this far, then stay, because the part everyone said was impossible starts here, and I promise you it is worth the seeing. The first thing Nora spent real money on was not a cow and not a tractor. It was the milking machine, because the milk was the money and the machine was where the money was leaking out. She could not afford a new one, so she did what Ada would have done, which was fix the one she had. She brought the vacuum down 15 points to where it belonged, so the pull was gentle as a calf and no more, and she pulled every hard cracked liner off the units and hung a full new set of soft ones. $40 she could barely spare, and the best $40 she ever spent. And she scrubbed and sterilized every hose and claw and gasket in the system until the whole machine ran clean as a kitchen. Then she changed the one thing that cost nothing and mattered most, which was the order of the milking. She and Gustav sorted the whole herd by hand into a string that made sense. The fresh, clean cows milked first while the machine was cleanest, the older cows next, and the 2 or 3 with any history of trouble milked dead last through a separate set of units, so their milk went in a pail and never near the tank, and their germs never rode the machine into a clean quarter. It was the exact system Ada had run for 39 years, and it was written down nowhere except in her granddaughter's hands, and it turned the barn around in a fortnight. The first milk test after that was the morning Nora had been living toward and dreading in equal measure. The creamery field man, a brisk young fellow named Delp, who had been the one to put Merritt on notice, came out with his cooler of little bottles and drew his sample from the tank and held up the reader and did not, at first, believe what it told him. He read it twice. Then he read it a 3rd time and looked at the heavy-set woman and the old Swede and the tired young farmer standing in the milk-house door, and he said the cell count on that tank had come down further in 6 weeks than he had ever seen a herd move. That the milk was clean, cleaner than clean. That it was, in fact, the best quality milk coming off any farm on his whole route, and that whatever they were doing out here they had best keep doing it. And then Delp, who was young and honest and a little ashamed, said to Merritt Vane that he owed him an apology, that he had written this farm off as a lost cause, and Merritt Vane looked not at Delp but at Nora, and said, loud enough for the field man to hear, that it was not his farm to take the credit for, that this was Nora Halvorsen's herd and Nora Halvorsen's doing, and it was the first time anyone in Cobble Hollow had said her name that way, as the person who had done the thing instead of the person the thing was done to, and Nora had to turn and busy herself with the tank valve so the 2 men would not see her face. The quality premium the creamery paid for clean milk was small money, a few cents on the hundredweight, but it was the first money the Delcourt Dairy had earned instead of merely spent in 3 years, and Nora took that first slightly larger check to the bank and paid Lowell Prine his April note in full and on time, and she watched the careful banker's eyebrows go up, and she said nothing. Because Ada had taught her that the only bragging that ever changed a man's mind was a payment made when he expected an excuse. Clean milk was the first battle, and the easiest. The harder one was the feed, Because the herd was thin, run down on a bagged ration, a co-op salesman had sold Merritt out of a chart without ever once looking at a cow. And Nora could not afford to keep buying it, and could not afford to have the cows keep losing flesh, and those two facts sat on her chest at 4 in the morning like a stone. Ada's answer, when Nora finally let herself hear it, was the oldest answer in the valley and the one everyone had forgotten. The Delcourt farm did not need to buy its way out of thin cows. It was sitting on the best spring-fed pasture in the township, 40 acres of hill grass that had never been plowed, and it had been letting that grass go to waste because Emil in his last years, and Merritt in his first, had both kept the cows standing in a muddy yard eating out of a wagon, the way the magazine said modern dairies did it. Nora walked that hill pasture end to end the last week of April with Gustav, the two of them reading the grass the way they read the cows, and she found under the winter mat exactly what her grandmother had promised would be there: clover and orchard grass and timothy and the deep-rooted things that the springs kept green a month ahead of the flat ground, and she made her decision. She fenced that hill into 8 paddocks with a single strand of wire and a box of step-in posts, cheaper than 1 week of the bagged ration, and she began to move the herd through it the way Ada had moved the Delcourt cows for 39 years before the salesman came. A fresh green paddock every morning, the cows grazing it down in a day and moving on so the grass behind them could rest in. Grow back thick, the manure spread even across the hill by the cows themselves instead of piled by the barn. It is called rotational grazing now, and they teach it in the colleges, but Ada had never called it anything but common sense, and it worked the way common sense works, slow and then all at once. Within 3 weeks, the thin cows began to bloom. Their coats came up slick and shining. Their manure loosened to the right green pat that told Nora their stomachs were right at last, and the milk in the tank came up too, not in a trickle but in a rising tide, because a cow on good spring grass in her own quiet rhythm makes milk the way a healthy tree makes leaves, without being driven to it. And the ration bill, which had been bleeding the farm white, fell to almost nothing, because the hill was feeding the herd for free the way it had been meant to since before any of them were born. Merritt Vane walked that green hill in the middle of May with the cows spread out grazing and their calves at their sides and the creek shining below, and he said to Nora, quietly, that his uncle used to talk about the pasture like it was a person, and that he had thought the old man was going soft, and that he was beginning to understand he had thrown away the best thing he owned because he had been too proud to ask the one person in the valley who knew how to use it. Nora did not answer that with words. She had learned that a man coming to the truth on his own should be let arrive in peace. The night the herd nearly cost her everything came the 3rd week of May, and it came the way trouble always comes to a dairy, at the worst hour, with no warning, to the animal she could least afford to lose. It was Juniper, the last daughter of the best cow the farm ever raised, and she was springing to calve with her first, and Nora had been watching her close because a heifer with her first calf is where a dairy so often breaks its heart. Nora woke at 2 in the morning the way she always woke, to no sound at all, only the certainty that something in the barn was wrong, and she went down the lane in the dark and found Juniper down in the straw of the box stall, straining and getting nowhere, and she knew within one look what was wrong, because Ada had made her put her hand inside 100 cows in trouble until she could see with her fingers in the dark. The calf was coming backward, hind feet first, and the hips locked in the birth canal, and a backward calf is a race against a clock, because once the cord pinches the calf will drown inside the mother in minutes if it is not pulled. And Nora was alone in the barn at 2 in the morning with a heifer worth more to her than money going down in front of her. She did not run for the phone. There was no vet within 40 minutes and no time to spare, and she had known this moment would come the way you know a note is coming due. She stripped off her coat and scrubbed her arm to the shoulder in warm water and iodine, and she got down in the straw behind the straining heifer and worked her hand in slow and gentle against the push, and she found the hocks and understood the tangle and, talking low the whole time in her grandmother's cadence, eased the calf's hind legs up into line, one at a time, the way Ada had taught her. Patient in a moment that gave her no reason to be patient. Then she looped the smooth cotton cords over the calf's pasterns and waited through her own hammering heart, for the heifer's next push, and when it came, she pulled with it, and only with it, down and out in the arc of the cow's own body, 40 years of a dead woman's knowledge running down her arms. And the calf came in a rush of warmth into the straw, backward and blue and still. And Nora Halvorsen did the last thing Ada had taught her for exactly this moment. She swung the calf up by its hind legs to drain the fluid from its lungs, and she laid it down and cleared its mouth with 2 fingers and rubbed it hard along the ribs with a fistful of straw, rough and fast, the way the mother's tongue would, and she stuck a clean straw up its nose to make it snort, and for 3 seconds that lasted a year, nothing happened at all. Then the calf coughed and shuddered and pulled one long ragged breath and another, and Juniper heaved herself around in the straw and began to lick her daughter with a low, worried rumble deep in her chest, and Nora sat back on her heels in the bloody straw at 2:30 in the morning and put her face in her clean hand and wept for everything at once, for the calf and for Tom and for Ada and for every year she had spent being told her hands were good for nothing but the shelving. In the morning she named the heifer calf Ada, and told no one why. And when Gustav came in at dawn and saw the dry calf up and nursing and the tired triumph on Nora's face, the old Swede looked at the pair of them a long moment, and then said, gruff, that maybe she had her grandmother's sense after all, and turned away quick to hide his own face, and that was as close to a blessing as Gustav Lindevist had given anyone in 20 years. Word of a thing gets around a small valley faster than the thing itself, and by the end of Maycobble Hollow had begun, grudgingly, to notice. The milk hauler talked, because milk haulers always talk, and what he said at the Blue Spoon was that the Delcourt tank was full and clean, and the count on the wall was the lowest on his route, and men who had laughed in April went quiet over their pie in May, not ready to say they had been wrong, but no longer quite comfortable saying they had been right. The public turning, the one the whole town would still be telling about at the feed mill years later, came in early June at Halbert Ames's own farm, and Nora did not go looking for it. She was hauling a load of straw home past the Ames place at midday when she saw Halbert and his 2 grown sons standing in a knot in the yard around a downed cow. And she saw the particular stiff-legged helplessness in the way they stood, and she knew before she stopped the truck what she was looking at. It was milk fever. The same thing that had killed 2 of Merritt's cows over the winter, a fresh cow whose body had poured so much calcium into her first flood of milk that she had none left to run her own muscles, going cold and stiff and slipping down toward a coma that would kill her inside the hour. Halbert Ames had already called the vet, and the vet was 40 minutes out on another farm, and the cow did not have 40 minutes, and Halbert knew it, and it was written all over his gray face because that cow was worth 2 months of his living. Nora Halvorsen pulled her straw truck into the yard of a man who had called her a fool in front of the whole feed mill, and got out and asked Halbert Ames if she could help. There was a moment there, brittle as spring ice, where the old man's pride stood square in the road, where he had to choose in front of his sons between his contempt for the fat woman and the life of his cow. And to his lasting credit, Halbert Ames chose the cow. He stepped back and let her at it. Nora had a case of the treatment in her own truck, because a dairy that grazes fresh cows on rich spring grass keeps milk fever bottles the way a house keeps matches, and she had it in her hands before the Ames boys understood what she meant to do. She knelt by the downed cow and found the big vein under the loose skin of the neck by feel, and she slipped the needle in clean on the first try, and she warmed the bottle of calcium against her own body and ran it in slow, a drop at a time the way Ada had taught her, because run in fast it will stop a weak heart cold. And all the while she kept one broad hand flat on the cow's chest over the heartbeat, reading it, ready to pinch the line off at the first stumble. It took 20 minutes. The Ames men stood around her in a silent ring and watched a heavyset produce clerk hold their cow's life on the end of a needle and a fingertip, and about 18 minutes in the cow's cold ears grew warm under Halbert's hand, and her eye cleared, and she gave a great groaning belch, and lifted her head off the ground for the first time in an hour. And a minute after that she gathered her legs and heaved herself up onto them and stood there swaying and blinking in the June sun, alive. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Halbert Ames, who was 70 years old and had been farming that ground since before Nora was born and had never in his life had to eat words this size, took off his cap and stood there holding it, and said, in front of his 2 sons and God and the whole bright morning, that he had been wrong about her, dead wrong, and that he was ashamed of it, and that anybody in Cobble Hollow who called Nora Halvorsen a fool again would answer to Halbert Ames. And Nora did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she did not accuse. She wiped her needle and capped her bottle, and told Halbert to keep that cow off the rich grass and give her a warm bran mash, and she would be right as rain by evening, and she got back in her straw truck and drove home, and it was not until she was out of sight of the Ames place that she let herself shake. Because reading a cow's heartbeat on the end of a needle takes a steadiness that costs. Something to spend. That was the day the valley turned. It did not turn all the way, and it did not turn overnight, but a man like Halbert Ames does not eat words in front of his sons over nothing. And by the middle of June there was a different feeling on the Wren Creek Road, and men who had slowed down to laugh in April slowed down now to look, and 1 or 2 of them lifted a hand off the wheel. The trouble with turning a farm around, though, is that the farm does not know it is winning, and it will still try to break your heart on an ordinary Tuesday. Nora's Tuesday came the 3rd week of June, in the shape of the bulk tank cooler, the same tired cooler Merritt had warned her about the very first day. The one machine on the place she had known all along was living on borrowed time. It quit in the night, the way the generator had quit in the night, and Nora came down to the milk house at 4 to find the tank full of the evening's milk and the morning's coming, and the cooler dead, and the milk already drifting up toward the temperature where the creamery will not take it, where a whole day's work and a whole day's money goes down the drain as waste. She had a truck payment and a bank note and no cushion at all, and a new cooler was thousands of dollars she did not have, and for 1 bad minute standing in that cold milk house Nora Halvorsen felt the whole thing sway under her like a barn in a wind. She did not let it sway her long. Panic is a thing you feel and then set down, Ada used to say, because the cow does not care that you are afraid. Nora made herself stand still in that cold milk house and think the way her grandmother would have thought, back before there were coolers at all, when the Delcourt milk was kept sweet by the one thing this farm had never run short of, which was cold spring water. The springs that greened the hill ran up cold as a well all summer long, and the old stone milk house had been built over one of them on purpose, with a shallow stone trough in the floor, where in Ada's girlhood the cans of milk had stood in the running spring water and stayed sweet till the hauler came. The trough was still there under a sheet of plywood and 40 years of clutter. Nora and Merritt cleared it out by lantern light before dawn and freed the old spring inlet, and by the time the sun came up cold spring water was running through that stone trough again for the first time in half a century. It was not cold enough by itself to hold Greta milk, but it did not have to be. Nora called the one man she knew would come, which was the milk hauler, and the hauler, who had been telling the town how good the Delcourt milk was, came an hour early and cold-hauled the tank before it could spoil, and saved that day's milk. And then the valley did the thing that a valley does when it has finally decided a person is one of its own. Halbert Ames heard about the cooler by noon, and Halbert Ames had a spare cooler compressor sitting in his machine shed off a tank he had retired 2 years back, and he loaded it on his truck and brought it out the Wren Creek Road himself and would not take a dime for it, and his 2 sons came with him, and the 3 of them, and Merritt and Gustav, had that compressor mated to the Delcourt tank by. Dark. It was not new, and it was not pretty, but it pulled the tank down cold and held it, and it cost Nora nothing but a supper she cooked for 6 tired people in the little cottage kitchen that night, biscuits and ham and a pie, and it was the first time in 4 years that Nora Halvorsen had cooked for a full table, and she stood at the stove with her back to them and listened to the men laughing about cows in her grandmother's cadence, and had to blink hard at the window. Merritt Vane stayed after the Ames men had gone. He helped her with the dishes, the two of them at the little sink, and there was a long, easy quiet between them that neither one hurried, and then he said, looking at the soap and not at her, that he had come home a year and a half ago hating this farm and everything on it, and that somewhere in the last 3 months he had stopped, and that he did not entirely understand how a woman he had tried to send home in the rain had turned his uncle's grave mistake into the best thing in his life. He said he did not know what he was trying to say. And Nora, who had buried one good, quiet man, and had promised herself she would not spend her strength saving it for a day that never came, dried her hands on her apron and told him he did not have to know yet, and that there was time, and that she had learned the hard way that the only things worth having on a farm were the ones you brought along slow. It was not a declaration, and it was not a kiss. It was two tired people at a sink agreeing, without quite saying it, to find out. And it was, in its plain way, the truest thing either of them had said to another soul in years. The milk came on strong all through that June and into July. The herd that had made a thin gray tank in March made a rising white tide by high summer, the cows slick and deep-bodied on the rotated grass, the count on the milkhouse wall the lowest in the co-op, and the check that came the 1st of July was a real check, a farming check, enough to pay the note and the feed and set a little by for the first time, and Nora took Merritt's share up to the house and did not leave it on the step this time, but handed it to him at the door, and watched a man who had signed away his life work in March hold the first honest profit that farm had turned in 3 years, and neither of them said anything. Because some payments say themselves. The bulk truck that backed up to the Delcourt Milkhouse in the middle of June, the shining stainless truck drawing off a full tank of the sweetest milk in the township from a farm the whole valley had sworn was finished, was watched by more than the hauler. Word had gone around, the way word does, and there were 3 or 4 trucks pulled over along the Wren Creek Road that morning. Men who had come, half of them ashamed to admit it even to themselves, just to see the thing they had said could not be done. Roy Tibbett was one of them. He had told the joke at the feed mill in March, the fat produce girl and the dead herd, and he stood at the fence rail that June morning with his cap in his hands and watched the truck pull away full. And when Nora came across the yard, wiping her hands, he made himself say it, awkward and red-faced, that he had been the one telling it as a joke, and that he was sorry, and that he had never in his life been so glad to be so wrong. And Nora Halvorson, who could have made him crawl and did not, only told him that the coffee was on in the cottage if he wanted a cup. And Roy Tibbett, who had come to eat a small serving of his own words, ended up sitting an hour at her table hearing about bloodlines and spring-fed grass, and drove home a different man. The valley had turned, and the farm was sound, and if the story of Nora Halvorson had been a smaller story, it might have ended there, in the warm middle of a good July. But farming does not deal in small stories, and the biggest trouble of all was still coming down the road, and it did not wear the face of a broken machine or a downed cow. It wore a business letter. It came the last week of July, one plain envelope to every dairy on the route, and Nora read hers standing in the milkhouse and felt the floor tilt for the second time that summer. The old farmer-owned creamery in town, the one that had bought Cobble Hollow's milk since before Ada was born, had been sold over the winter to a large processing company 3 states away, and the new owners had done the arithmetic that large companies do, and had decided that hauling milk out of a narrow valley full of small herds cost them more than it was worth. The letter was polite, and it was final. As of the 1st of October, the company would no longer send a truck up the Wren Creek Road. Any farm that wished to keep shipping milk would have to haul it themselves the 31 miles to the plant in Merrill, twice a day, every day, in their own refrigerated truck, a truck none of the valley farms owned and none of them could afford, or else find another buyer. And there was no other buyer, because the valley was the tail end of the line and always had been. It was, everyone understood at once, the death of dairy farming in Cobble Hollow, not by any one farm's failure, but by a decision made in an office by men who had never smelled the barn. The valley met about it in the church basement the first week of August, 40 grim farmers on folding chairs, and Nora sat in the back the way she always sat, and listened to good men she had come to know talk themselves in a circle toward the same dead end. They could not each buy a truck. They could not haul alone. The company would not budge. One after another, the older men said the word that Nora had spent her whole life hearing, the word the town had used about her and about the marsh cows and about everything it had given up on, that it was too far gone, that a valley of little herds could not stand against a company that big, and that the wise thing, the reasonable thing, was to sell the cows now while there was still a beef market and get out clean. And Nora Halvorson, who had bought a dead herd for beef money in April and was shipping the best milk on the route in August, sat in the back of that church basement and felt something come up in her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and she stood up. It was the first time in her life she had ever stood up to speak in a public room, and 40 faces turned to look at the big quiet woman in the back, and some of those faces still carried the old amusement, and Nora let them. And she said her piece plain. She said that the company was right about one thing, that no one farm in that valley could buy a truck or haul alone. And then she said that the company was wrong about the thing that mattered, because there was not one farm in that valley, there were 30, and 30 farms that could not each buy a truck could together buy one truck, and 30 farms that could not each haul could take turns hauling, and 30 farms that had no buyer could, if they stopped waiting to be bought and started acting like the creamery their grandfathers had built, become their own buyer. She told them her grandmother had helped run the old Farmer Creamery Cooperative in its last good years, that she had grown up hearing how it worked, that a cooperative was nothing more than neighbors agreeing to do together what none of them could do alone, and that the valley had let the last one die because it got comfortable being bought from, and that comfort was over now whether they liked it or not, and the only question left was whether they would go down as 30 farms that quit or come up as one that would not. There was a silence in that church basement the exact shape of the one in the feed mill in March, and then old Halbert Ames stood up out of his folding chair, and Halbert Ames said that he had eaten his words about this woman once already this summer and found them nourishing, and that he was ready to eat the town's words too, and that he was in, whatever it took, and who was standing with him, and one by one, slow and then all at once, the way the good things came in that valley, the men of Cobble Hollow stood up out of their folding chairs. That was the day the story stopped being about one woman and one herd and became about a whole valley, and it was, Nora would say for the rest of her life, the proudest thing her grandmother's knowing ever bought. Because Ada had given her the trade one cow at a time and had never once dreamed it might one day save the whole road. Standing up in a church basement is easy compared to what comes after it, and the 6 weeks between that meeting and the 1st of October were the hardest Nora had worked since the April she cleaned the barn. Because a cooperative is a beautiful idea and a mountain of plain, ugly labor. There was a truck to find, a used refrigerated tank truck, and they found one at last in a lot outside Merrow, tired but sound. For $11,000 none of them had, and 30 farms put in what they could, some 300 and some 3,000, and Nora put in the last of Tom's coffee can change on top of the last of her own thin cushion, because she would not ask a neighbor to risk $1 she was not risking herself. There was a route to plan, 30 farms up and down the valley in an order that made sense, and a schedule of drivers, each farm taking its turn at the wheel, and a set of books to keep, and it was Nora, to nobody's surprise and her own quiet astonishment, who ended up keeping them, the heavy-set produce clerk who had learned to add a column of figures in her head, sacking feed. Sitting up nights at the cottage table with a ledger and a lamp, doing for a whole valley what she had learned to do for one farm. And there was the plant in Merrow to bring around, because a big company plant does not want to buy from a ragtag farmer cooperative any more than it wanted to haul from them, and it was Merritt Vane, who could talk to men in offices in a way Nora could not, who drove to Merrow in his good shirt and sat across a desk and made the case, farm milk cleaner than anything the company was buying, delivered to their dock at the farmer's own cost and risk, a bargain the plant would be fools to turn down. And he made it well. And they took it. Because in the end, even a company 3 states away will buy good milk cheap when it is set on their loading dock. But the thing that made the Cobble Hollow Cooperative more than a stopgap, the thing that turned a valley hauling its own milk into a valley that could not be starved out again, was Nora's other idea, the one she had carried since the church basement and had said to no one but Merritt on a warm night on the milkhouse steps. A valley that only sold raw milk to a distant plant would always be at the mercy of the plant's price, she said, the same way she had been at the mercy of the creamery all summer. But a valley that turned some of its own milk into something that kept into butter and cheese could sell that anywhere at its own price under its own name. The way the old creamery had done when the town still bottled and churned its own. It would take years. It would take a little cheese room built onto the old creamery building the co-op would buy back cheap from the company that did not want it. It would take a cheesemaker, and Gustav, it turned out, grinning his gap-toothed grin, had made farmstead cheese as a boy in the old country and had never once been asked. It was a long road, and Nora knew it, and she laid it out to the co-op not as a promise, but as a direction, a thing to build toward across 10 years instead of 1, and the valley, which had learned that summer to trust the big woman's long, slow way of building things, voted to start. In the middle of all of that, the hay had to come in, because a dairy that grazes all summer still has to put up feed for the winter, and hay does not wait on cooperatives. The last week of August turned hot, and the grass on the far meadows came ripe all at once, and the weather radio promised 3 clear days and then a week of rain, and it was drop everything and cut, because hay rained on in the swath is hay lost, and a winter of bought feed is a winter that breaks a farm. Nora and Merritt and Gustav cut and raked and baled from before light to after dark for 3 days straight, and on the 3rd day, with a wall of blue-black cloud building over the west hill and half the crop still down in the field, the whole valley came. They came the way they had come for the compressor, only 30 strong this time, trucks and wagons and old balers and young sons, Halbert Ames and Roy Tibbett and men Nora had barely met, and they ran that hay into the barn ahead of the storm in a roaring golden dusk, a whole valley on one farm's meadow racing the rain. And the last wagon rolled into the barn floor, and the doors banged shut, and the sky opened up all in the same 5 minutes, and 30 soaked laughing people stood in the mow with the rain hammering the roof and the sweet smell of new hay all around them, and knew they had beaten it. Nora stood in the barn door looking out at the rain with Merritt beside her, both of them chaff-covered and worn to the bone, and he took her broad hand in his without a word, the first time, and she let him, and they stood like that a long while, and watched the storm they had outrun come down on the mown fields, and neither of them said anything at all, because everything worth saying was already said in the full barn behind them. September came in gold and cool, and for a few weeks it seemed the worst was behind them. The co-op truck made its first run to Merrow the morning after the hay was in, Halbert Ames at the wheel of the valley's own tank truck with the whole route's milk cold behind him, and it came home that evening with the first cooperative check, small but real, split 30 ways. Milk money the valley had earned on its own terms for the first time in anyone's memory. The cheese room was still just a swept corner of the old creamery building and a stack of Gustav's hand-drawn plans, but it was a beginning, and the Delcourt herd was deep-bodied and clean, and the tank ran full every day, and Nora Halvorsen, who had come to that farm in April, a fool in the town's eyes, walked her hill pasture in the first week of September with a good man's ring of a promise not yet spoken but understood between them, and let herself believe for a little while that the fight was won. The creek took it back in one night, the way water does. It had been a wet autumn upstream, though the valley had not felt it. And the 3rd week of September a slow, warm storm sat over the headwaters of Wren Creek for 2 days and would not move, and dumped a summer's rain onto ground already full, and the creek that ran quiet along the Delcourt fence line all summer began, on the second night, to rise. Nora had grown up on that water and knew its moods, and she did not like the sound of it when she went down to the barn for the evening milking, a deeper voice than the creek should have, a hurrying. And she checked the low gauge a mile had painted on the bridge piling years ago, and did not like what she saw there either, the water already climbing past the second mark, with the rain still coming. She moved the herd up off the low pasture that evening as a precaution, up onto the high paddocks near the barn. All but 3 heavy springing cows and their week-old calves that she had bedded in the sheltered lean-to on the near meadow, the low ground she had never once in her life seen the creek reach. She should have moved them too. She would tell herself that for years, but the lean-to had never flooded in living memory, and the cows were heavy and close to calving and hard to move in the dark, and she made the reasonable choice, the safe-seeming choice. And she went to bed at 10 with the rain drumming, and woke at 1 to a sound that put her on the floor before she was awake. The sound of the creek in the yard. She came out onto the cottage step in her nightgown and her husband's barn coat with the lantern high, and saw where the near meadow had been, black water. The creek had jumped its banks in the dark and spread across the low ground in a broad silent flood, and the lean-to was out in the middle of it, and she could hear, thin and terrible across the water, the bawling of the cows and the higher cry of the calves marooned on a shrinking island of bedding with the water still rising around them. She did not stop to think, and she did not stop to be afraid. She hammered on Merritt's door and sent him for the tractor and the flatbed and every rope on the place, and she hauled Gustav out of his cottage bed, and she called Halbert Ames on the party line and said only 2 words, "The creek," and hung up, and she went into that black water in her nightgown and her barn coat before the men had their boots on. Because the calves were going under first, and calves do not swim. The water was to her waist, and then to her chest, cold enough to lock a smaller person's lungs, and running hard, and Nora Halvorsen waded out into it, into the dark, toward the sound of the drowning calves, with a rope over her shoulder, feeling the ground fall away under her boots. Using every ounce of the size and the strength the town had spent 35 years telling her was good for nothing, planting her broad body against the current like a piling, and she reached the lean-to and found the 3 cows standing to their bellies in the flood with the water at the calves' necks, and she got her arms around the first calf and lifted it. 40 pounds of terrified, struggling life up out of the water and against her chest, and she carried it back against the current the way she had carried 1,000 feed sacks, and set it on the high ground, and turned around and went back in for the next. She got the second calf the same way, and by the time she came out with it, Merritt had the tractor down at the water's edge with its lights blazing out across the flood, and Gustav was wading in behind her with a rope, and the 2 of them got the third calf between them and dragged it choking and coughing up onto the bank, and then there were only the 3 cows left, too heavy to carry, standing terrified and bawling in water that was now to their backs and still rising. Cows can swim, but a frightened cow in a night flood will as often as not turn the wrong way and swim out into the deep and drown from sheer panic, and these 3 were half mad with fear and would not leave the place their calves had been. Nora waded back out to them, and this was the part the valley would tell for a generation, because there is no machine for it and no trick. There is only knowing an animal and being unafraid. She got in among the 3 panicked cows in chest, deep running water in the dark, and she did the thing she had done to Juniper in the barn that first day. She laid her broad, steady body against the led cow's shoulder and gave the animal her calm to lean into, and she talked to them, low and even, her grandmother's cadence, over the roar of the water, until the nearest cow's ear came around toward her voice. And then she got a rope on that cow's halter and turned her head by main strength toward the tractor lights and the high ground. And she waded ahead of her into the current, leading, and the cow, because it trusted the big, warm, steady thing in the water more than it trusted its own fear, came. And where one cow goes in a flood, the others follow, and the second cow swung in behind the first, and the third behind the second, and Nora Halvorsen led 3 cows through belly-deep flood water in the dark by the sound of her own voice up out of the creek and onto the high pasture, and the whole herd of them, 3 cows and 3 calves, stood streaming and bawling and alive in the tractor lights, while the meadow they had stood on went black and deep behind them. She had barely got them up when the headlights came down the Wren Creek Road, 1 truck and then another and then 5. The whole valley turning out in the middle of the night the way it had turned out for the hay, because Halbert Ames had made 2 words into a phone tree. And they came with lights and ropes and boats and did not once ask whose cows they were saving, and they spent that whole streaming night moving stock and sandbagging the milk house and pulling Merritt's stalled truck out of the rising water. 30 neighbors and 1 big woman soaked to the bone, and by the gray light of dawn the rain had finally moved off the headwaters, and the creek had crested and begun, grudgingly, to fall. They lost no cow. They lost no calf. They lost a good deal of fence and a low field of second crop hay, and the near meadow was silted a foot deep, and the lean-to was gone downstream entirely, but the herd stood whole on the high pasture in the first cold light, every animal accounted for, chewing their cud already, telling Nora in the only language they had that they trusted the world again. And Nora Halvorsen stood in the ruined dawn in a nightgown gone black with mud, so tired she was swaying, and looked at the herd her grandmother had loved standing safe on the hill, and did not weep this time, because she was past weeping, and only stood there while the valley gathered slow and quiet around her in the wet gray light. It was Halbert Ames who said it, because it seemed to fall to Halbert Ames that summer to say the things the town needed said. He looked at the woman standing mud to the shoulders in the dawn, the woman he had called a fool in the feed mill in March, and he took off his soaked cap, and he said, in front of 30 neighbors, that he had lived in that valley 70 years and had never seen anything like what he had watched Nora Halvorsen do in that water in the dark, and that there was not a man there, himself first of all, who would have gone in after those calves the way she had, and that the town had spent 35 years looking at that woman and seeing her size, and had been blind as posts the whole time, because they had been looking at the strongest, steadiest, most knowing hand in the whole of Cobble Hollow and calling it too soft for hard work. And the men around him, soaked and worn and humbled by the night, took off their caps one after another in the cold dawn. Not one of them left in that valley who would ever again say a word against her, and Nora Halvorsen stood among them too tired to speak, and understood all at once that she had come home. The days after a flood are their own long test, less dramatic than the water, and harder in their way, because the water leaves and the ruin stays. The near meadow was buried a foot deep in Gray Creek silt. The fence along the low ground was gone, and the second crop hay Nora had counted on for the winter lay flat and sour under the mud. She got up the morning after the flood on 3 hours of sleep and did the milking anyway, because the cows did not know there had been a flood, and then she walked the ruined meadow with Gustav and made a plan, because a plan is the only thing that keeps a farmer from sitting down in the mud and quitting. The silt, Gustav pointed out in his flat old way, wiping it between his fingers, was creek bottom, the richest dirt in the valley, and a meadow that took a foot of it would grow grass like a jungle come spring if they worked it in instead of cursing it. So they did not curse it. They disked the silt into the drowned sod through the last warm weeks of the fall, turning a disaster into next year's pasture the way Ada had turned everything hard into something useful. And Nora thought, driving the disk back and forth across the gray meadow in the cool, bright afternoons, of the thing her grandmother used to say when the hail came or the price fell or the barn roof went, that a farmer is just a person who has decided every single morning to bet on tomorrow, and that the day you stop making that bet is the day you are done no matter how much money is in the bank. The winter feed was the real worry, with the second crop lost, and here again the valley closed around her, because a valley that has watched a woman carry its calves out of a flood does not let her herd go short of hay. Albert Ames sent over 100 bales he swore he did not need. Roy Tibbett, who had told the joke in March, hauled in 2 wagon loads and would not name a price, and said only that he figured he owed her about that much interest on being a horse's rear end, and Nora let him say it, because a man needs to make his own amends in his own words. She did not take the hay as charity. She wrote every bale down in her ledger at a fair price and paid it back that winter in butter and in labor and in the milking relief she gave freely up and down the road whenever a neighbor took sick. Because Ada had taught her that a debt paid keeps a friendship, and a debt forgiven can sometimes lose one, and that the co-op would only hold together as long as every farm on it kept its accounts square and its pride intact. The trouble that came next did not come from the weather. It came, the way the biggest troubles in that valley always seemed to come, in a clean car with out-of-county plates. His name was Curtis Denrow, and he ran the largest dairy operation in 3 counties, 2,000 cows in a set of long steel barns down on the flat by Merrow, where the animals never saw grass and were milked around the clock by machines, and he had heard. The way men like Curtis Denrow always hear, that there was a valley full of small farms in trouble, land going cheap along a creek with good water and highway frontage, and he came up the Wren Creek Road the 2nd week of October in a car that had never seen mud to buy Cobble Hollow out from under itself, one farm at a time. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid one, and that was what made him dangerous. He was polite. He sat in kitchens up and down the valley and laid out the plain figures, that a small dairy could not compete with a big one, that the co-op was a brave gesture that would feel inside 3 years, that he would pay a fair price today for land that would be worth nothing when the cheese room went broke, and that the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the safe thing, was to take his money and be done with the hard, uncertain life while there was still money to take. And it was a good argument, and it frightened people, because it was made of the same word that had haunted Nora her whole life, the word too far gone, only dressed now in a suit and speaking softly across a kitchen table. And 1 or 2 of the older farmers, tired and flood-shaken and not getting younger, began to listen. Nora did not try to out-argue Curtis Denrow. She had learned long ago that you cannot win a frightened person with a louder fear, and that the man with numbers on his side will always sound right in a kitchen. Instead, she did what her grandmother would have done, which was to make the future she was promising real enough to touch. Because a person will believe a thing they can put in their mouth long after they have stopped believing a thing they are told. She went to Gustav, and she took the last of the co-op's thin treasury and her own credit at the bank, and she told the old Swede to build his cheese room. Not the great creamery of the 10-year plan, not yet, but one clean tiled room in the corner of the old building. 1 vat, 1 press, 1 cool stone cellar with slatted shelves, enough for Gustav Lindvist to make, at last, at 71 years old, the cheese he had made as a boy and never once been asked to make in 50 years of milking other men's cows. And Gustav made it. He made a plain, firm farmstead cheese out of the cooperative's own clean grass-fed milk, the way his mother had taught him in a country he had left as a boy. And he wrapped the wheels in cloth and greased them and set them down in the cool cellar to age, and he would let no one hurry him. And he told Nora that cheese, like everything else worth having, could not be forced, and would come in its own time or not at all. And Nora smiled at that because it was pure Ada in an old man's accent. The first wheels were ready the week before Thanksgiving, and Nora took them to the one place in the valley where the whole town would be gathered, which was the church harvest supper, and she did not make a speech, because she had learned that the cheese would speak better than she could. She simply set the wheels out on the long table among the pies and the hams with a knife beside them, the first cheese made in Cobble Hollow in 50 years, made from the valley's own cows on the valley's own grass by the valley's own hands, and she stood back and let the town taste what it had almost let die. And the town tasted it, and went quiet, and then went loud, because it was good, plainly and undeniably good, better than anything in the cold case at the market in Merrow, and old people who had grown up on valley cheese and thought they would never taste it again stood in the church basement with their eyes wet. And Curtis Denrow, who had come to the supper the way a wolf comes to a fold, in his good suit, with his soft argument ready. stood at the edge of the room and watched a valley fall in love with itself again over a plate of cheese, and understood, as a smart man will, that he had lost. He was gracious about it, which Nora respected. He found her by the coffee urn at the end of the evening, and he told her, quietly and without any edge, that he had bought out 4 valleys in his life and had never once had one turned against him by a wheel of cheese, and that he did not think the Cobble Hollow Cooperative would be an easy thing to buy after tonight, and that he suspected that had been precisely her intention. And then Curtis Denrow said the thing that was, in its cool business way, the largest concession of all, larger even than Halbert Ames taking off his cap, because it came from a man with no reason on earth to flatter her. He said that in 30 years of buying up small farms he had learned to spot the one thing that could stop him, which was not money and was not law, but was a single person stubborn enough and skilled enough to make the neighbors believe they could stand, and that he had not expected to find that person in this valley, and that he certainly had not expected to find her sacking cheese in a produce apron, and that he had been wrong, and that he would take his car back down the county road in the morning and leave Cobble Hollow to her. And he shook her hand, and he did, and the valley never saw Curtis Denrow again, and the land along Wren Creek stayed in the hands of the people who worked it. It was that night, driving home from the church supper in the cold dark, with the empty cheese plates rattling on the seat and the first stars hard overhead, that Merritt Vane finally said the thing he had been carrying since the sink in June. He pulled the truck over at the top of the hill where the whole valley lay spread out below them under the stars, the scattered yellow lights of 30 farms that were still farms because of the woman beside him, and he turned to her in the dark and told her that he had come to Cobble Hollow to bury a stranger and sell a burden, and had stayed to find the only thing he had ever wanted and never had a name for, and that he did not have his uncle's farm to offer her because it was already more hers than his, and that all he had to offer was himself, such as he was, a man she had taught nearly everything he knew about the work he now could not imagine leaving. And he asked her plainly, with no ring because he had not dared buy one, if she would marry him. And Nora Halvorsen, who had buried one good, quiet man at 26 and had promised herself she was done saving her strength for a day that never came, sat in the truck at the top of the hill above the lights of the valley she had saved, and did not make him wait, and said yes. They were married in the second week of December, in the same little white church where the valley had voted to save itself, and half of Cobble Hollow came, which surprised no one any more. And Nora wore her grandmother's brooch on a good gray dress, and Merritt wore his one suit, and Gustav Lindqvist gave her away, because there was no one living with a better right, and afterward there was cheese, and there were pies, and there was dancing in the church basement, and Halbert Ames danced with the bride and stepped on her feet and did not care, and it was the first wedding in years that the whole valley agreed had been worth the coming. They did not go anywhere after. There were cows to milk that same evening, 40 of them, and the bride and groom changed out of their good clothes and went down to the barn together in the early dark and did the milking side by side the way they had done it every evening since April. And that, Nora thought, pulling the units and pouring the tank, and hearing her husband whistling low to the cows down the alley, was the truest wedding trip a dairy could give, the plain shared work of a life that was finally wholly theirs. Then came the winter, and the winter did not care that they were happy. It came down hard in January, the way it does in that country, and it brought with it the test that every dairy dreads. The one that comes at 3 a.m. in a blizzard when the whole world is white and closed and there is no help within reach. It was a cow named Sorrel, a good deep milker 2 days fresh, and she went down with milk fever in the dead middle of the worst storm of the year, the same cold, stiffening slide toward death that Nora had pulled the Ames cow back from in June, only now the wind was screaming and the snow was sideways and the phone line was down under the ice, and the vet might as well have been on the moon. Nora went out to the barn at 3 a.m. through snow to her thighs, roped to the clothesline so she would not lose the house in the whiteout, and she found Sorrel flat and cold, with her head kinked back over her flank, minutes from gone, and she did what her grandmother had taught her. Alone in a lantern-lit barn with a blizzard trying to tear the roof off, she found the vein by feel in the dim light, and she warmed the calcium against her own body, and she ran it in slow, one hand flat on the cow's chest, reading the heart the way she had read it that June morning in the Ames yard, ready to pinch off at the first stumble. And she talked the whole time in the low, even cadence that was half her grandmother's and now half her own. And she brought sorrow back from the edge in a barn no one else on earth could have reached that night, and she sat in the straw afterward with the storm howling and the saved cow's head heavy and warm in her lap. And she understood in her bones the thing Ada had told her a lifetime ago, that the knowing is only worth anything in the hours when there is no one to call. And that those hours are the whole of farming, and that a woman who has the knowing in her hands is never truly alone in the dark, no matter how the wind blows. The note came due, in a manner of speaking, the first week of February. Lowell Prine, the careful banker who had warned Nora in April that she was likely to lose everything, sent word that he would like her to come in. And Nora drove to town through the plowed snowbanks, not knowing whether it was good news or bad, because a banker's summons rarely is the one it seems. What Prine wanted, it turned out, was to tell her, in the stiff, embarrassed way of a man unused to being wrong, that the Delcourt account, the account he had privately expected to write off by August, was the healthiest small farm account on his books, current on every payment and running a full season ahead of the schedule he had set, and that he had that morning marked Merritt Vane's debt as very nearly cleared, a full year before the note came due. And then Lowell Prine, who had lent money in that valley for 30 years and had learned to read a farm's future the way Nora read a cow's, took off his glasses and said the thing bankers almost never say out loud, that he had been in the business long enough to know the difference between a farm that was lucky and a farm that was run, and that hers was run, better run than any farm that size he had ever carried, and that he had told his own board of directors as much, and had recommended that the bank stand behind the whole Cobble Hollow Cooperative and its cheese room with a proper loan on fair terms, because he had watched a valley he had been ready to foreclose on turn itself around behind one woman. And a banker who cannot recognize that when it is standing in his own lobby has no business lending money at all. The cheese carried them through the winter in more ways than money. Gustav's cellar filled with wheels through December and January, and Nora, who kept the co-op's books and had a produce clerk's eye for a shelf, began to sell it, first at the church and the feed mill, then to a grocer in Merrow who tasted it and ordered all Gustav could make, then, by word of mouth, the way good things travel, to a specialty shop 3 counties over that paid a city price for country cheese and asked for more than the one small vat could give. By February, the cheese room in the corner of the old creamery was the busiest place in the valley on a Tuesday, and the co-op voted, on Lowell Prine's fair new loan, to build the rest of it out, at last. A second vat and a proper aging cave and a cutting room. 10 years of Nora's plan pulled forward into one, and Gustav Lindqvist, who had milked other men's cows for 50 years and been asked for nothing but his back, spent his 72nd winter teaching 2 young men of the valley to make cheese so that the knowing in his hands would not go into the ground with him the way Aras so nearly had. That was the thing Nora thought about most, that winter, standing in the warm cheese room watching an old man pass his craft to the young. She had spent 4 years grieving that her grandmother's knowing had nowhere to go, that she carried a whole trade in her hands and no one would trust a fat woman with a living animal, and she saw now that the grief had been the point of the whole story. That a knowing with nowhere to go is the loneliest thing in the world, and that the cure for it is not to be handed a farm, but to be needed, and that the valley had needed exactly what she carried and had been too blind to know it, until a herd was dying and a woman walked in off the road and started naming cows. She thought of Ada often that winter, more than she had since the funeral, because the farm was full of her now, in the milking order and the water cups and the rotated grass and the low even voice Nora heard coming out of her own mouth in the dark barn. She thought of the February morning long ago when Ada had told her that the milk is only the money and the cow is the farm. And she understood at last that her grandmother had been telling her something larger than dairying, that the milk is the money and the cow is the farm in every life there is, that the thing you can count is never the thing that matters, and that a person, like a farm, will bleed to death with a full tank if she forgets what she is really for. Not every soul in Cobble Hollow came around at the same pace, and Nora, who had been on the wrong end of the town's judgment her whole life, did not expect them to. The last to soften, oddly, was a woman, Vesta Prine, the banker's wife, who ran the church women's circle and had for years counted Nora among the sad cases of the parish. The poor heavy Halvorsen girl, who had lost her husband young, and would surely never amount to much, and who had said as much, kindly, over more than one quilting frame. Vesta Prine did not concede in a barnyard or a church basement. She conceded in the way of women who have been quietly unkind, slowly and then all at once, over a winter of watching, until one raw March afternoon, almost exactly a year from the day it all began, she appeared at the cottage door with a covered dish and a stiff back, and told Nora, not quite able to meet her eye, that she had been coming to think she owed her an apology going back some years, that she had spent a long time pitying a woman who had turned out to need no pity at all, and that she had come to ask, if it was not too late, whether Nora would take over the very church supper Vesta had run for 20 years, because the circle had all agreed there was no one in the valley the town would rather be fed by. And Nora Halvorsen, who could have remembered every kind, cruel word Vesta Prine had ever said over a quilting frame, and did remember them, took the covered dish and asked the woman in for coffee instead, because Ada had taught her that the only revenge worth taking is to become so plainly good that the people who doubted you have to live the rest of their lives knowing they were wrong, and that this revenge is best served warm with cream at your own kitchen table. Spring came back to the valley the way it always came, late and then all at once, the creek dropping sweet and clear inside its banks again, as if it had never risen at all, the springs greening the hill a full month ahead of the flat ground, and the silted meadow, the ruined near meadow that the flood had buried a foot deep the autumn before, came up in May in grass so thick and green and heavy that men slowed their trucks on the Wren Creek road to look at it, the richest hay ground in the township now, made rich by the very disaster that had nearly drowned the herd, exactly the way Gustav had said it would, exactly the way Ada would have known. Nora stood at the edge of that meadow the first warm morning it was tall enough to lay a hand on, and she thought that there was the whole of it, right there, that the flood that comes to drown you leaves the silt that feeds you if you have the stubbornness to work it in instead of cursing it, and that this was true of a meadow, and true of a marriage, and true, God knew, of a life. The herd came into its second spring on that farm, deep-bodied and slick and quiet, 40 cows, and a barn full of heifer calves coming up behind them, and among them, grown now into a fine young cow springing to her own first calf, was Ada. The backward calf Nora had pulled blue and still from the straw a year before, and rubbed back to breath with a fistful of straw. And when Ada the heifer calved that May, easy and clean in a green paddock in the daylight the way a well-kept cow should, and stood and licked her daughter dry in the sun, Nora watched from the fence and felt the whole year turn full circle in her chest. The last daughter of the best cow the farm ever raised, carrying the line forward into a barn that a year before the whole county had sworn was finished. The cheese won its ribbon in August. Gustav had entered 3 wheels of his best-aged farmstead in the state fair almost as a joke, an old man's whim, and the letter came in the middle of the summer that the Cobble Hollow Cooperative Cheese had taken first in its class over every creamery in the state, big and small. And the valley that had been a punchline at the feed mill a year and a half before drove down to the fair 100 strong to stand around a blue ribbon and a wheel of their own cheese in a glass case and feel, most of them for the first time in their lives, that the wide indifferent world had finally looked at Cobble Hollow and found it worth something. And it was Halbert Ames, standing in front of that glass case with his grandchildren, who said it best and said it plainest. That the ribbon was fine and the money was finer, But the true thing they had won was the one you could not hang in a case, which was that a valley full of people had learned they did not have to be saved by anybody, that they could stand on their own grass and make their own way, and that they had learned it from a woman most of them had spent their whole lives looking straight past. That was the season Nora told Merritt she was carrying their first child, on a warm evening on the milk-house steps where he had first spoken his heart to her the summer before. And Merritt Vane, who had come to the valley with nothing and been given more than he ever thought to ask for, put his weathered hand flat and careful against her and did not say a word, and they sat on the step in the long gold light and watched the cows come up the lane from the pasture in their slow evening line, and Nora thought about all the 4 in-the-morning risings of her overlooked life. All the years she had woken in the dark, with a knowing in her hands and nowhere on earth to put it, and understood that every one of those lonely mornings had been leading, without her ever guessing it, straight to this step and this man and this herd and this valley and the small new life she now carried into it. And that nothing in a life is ever truly wasted, only saved, sometimes for longer than you can bear, until the morning the world finally has need of exactly what you are. She said the thing then, out loud, half to Merritt and half to the memory of the woman who had taught her every word of it, the one true sentence of the whole long story, the one she would say again years later to a wide, solemn granddaughter of her own on an upturned bucket in that same barn. She was never nothing, she said. She had always been this. They just had never once bothered to look. If you have stayed with Nora this far, then let me show you what that valley became, because a story like this one earns its ending in the years that come after the hard part is over, and the after is the part the town would want you to see. The little cheese room in the corner of the old creamery grew, across the next few years, into the whole building and then past it. Into a proper creamery again. The first Cobble Hollow had run since before Nora was born, with a cutting room and a cold case and a small storefront where the valley sold its own butter and its own cheese under its own name to people who drove up the Wren Creek Road on purpose now, from the cities, to buy them. The co-op that had begun as 30 frightened farmers taking turns hauling one used truck became a thing the colleges sent people to study, a model of how a valley of small farms could stand against the big flat operations by doing together what none could do alone and by turning their own good milk into something the world would pay a fair price for. And Nora Halvorson, who had kept the books by lamplight at a cottage table the first hard winter, kept them still, in an office over the creamery now, the most trusted hand in the valley's whole affairs. The thing that told the true story, though, was not the ribbons or the storefront or the studies. It was the young people. For 30 years the young of Cobble Hollow had grown up and moved away, the way the young leave every small hard place, because there was no living to be made on a dying road, and the valley had been quietly aging toward its own end long before the creamery ever sent its letter. But a creamery needs cheesemakers, and a co-op needs drivers, and a growing valley needs young backs and young families, and one by one, across those years, the young began to stay, and some who had left began to come back, and the school that had been down to one room filled its second again, and Cobble Hollow, which had been sliding toward the same quiet death as 100 other valleys, turned and began, slowly, to live. That was the true after-reveal, larger than any harvest, that a woman the town had called too soft for hard business had not only saved a herd, but had turned the tide of a whole dying place, and had done it not with money she never had, but with the one thing she had carried all along, the knowing in her hands and the stubbornness to spend it. They did not forget where it started. When the creamery was finished, the co-op put a small brass plate by the door, and it did not carry Nora's name, because she would not have it, but it carried 2 others at her asking. It carried the name of Emile Delcourt, who had milked that herd for half a century and named a cow Juniper under a frost, so that the man whose grave mistake had started it all would be remembered for the 50 good years and not the one bad one. Because Nora had learned from Ada that you honor the whole of a person and not the worst day of them, and under his it carried the name of Ada Halvorson, herdswoman, 39 years? The woman who had given her whole overlooked life to that barn and died, believing her knowing would go into the ground with the man she served, and whose granddaughter had proved her wrong in the largest way a granddaughter can, by carrying the knowing forward and letting it save a valley. Gustav Lindqvist lived to see the creamery finished, and to teach 4 young cheesemakers his mother's craft, and to hold Nora and Merritt's first child, a broad, solemn baby girl, on his knotted old knees in the cheese cellar among the aging wheels, before he died quietly in his sleep in his 80th winter with a wheel of his own cheese in the case at the state fair and a valley full of people. Who knew at last what his hands had always been able to do? They buried him next to Ada, at his own asking. The 2 old dairy hands who had milked side by side for 20 years laid down at last within reach of one another, and the whole valley came, and Nora spoke the words over him because there was no one with a better right. And she said only that Gustav Lindqvist had spent 50 years being asked for nothing but his back, and had turned out, when someone finally thought to ask, to be carrying a whole art in his hands the entire time, and that if the valley remembered one thing about the man it should remember to ask, always, of every quiet, overlooked soul among them, what knowing they might be carrying that no one had ever once thought to want. The child was a girl, and they named her Ada, of course they did, for the second Ada on the place if you counted the heifer, and she was born broad and solemn and watchful, with her mother's wide, steady hands, and she grew up the way Nora had grown up, on an upturned bucket in a stanchion barn, watching a heavy, quiet woman strip out the last milk from a cow's back quarters by the light of one bare bulb. Except that this time the woman on her feet was her own mother, and the barn was her own family's, and no one anywhere in the valley would ever once look at the wide, serious little girl following her mother down the alley and think her too soft for hard work. Because the whole of Cobble Hollow had learned, the hard way, exactly what a wide, serious Halvorsen woman was worth. Nora taught her the way Ada had taught, one cow at a time, one true thing at a time. She put the child's small hand flat against a warm flank and taught her to feel a cud come up, to count the 4 slow beats of a healthy rumen against her palm the way you feel for a pulse, and told her that a cow chewing her cud is a cow telling you she trusts the world enough to stop watching it. She taught her that a cow gives her milk down out of trust and not out of fear, and that the loud men who curse and kick in a parlor are the very ones whose herds come up short in the tank. She taught her to read a cow the way other people read a face, from the set of an ear and the flick of a tail and the smell of a breath, and she taught her. One bitter February morning in the alley behind the cows, exactly as it had been taught to her, that the milk is only the money, and the cow is the farm, and a dairy that forgets the difference will bleed to death with a full tank. And she taught her, because it was the truest thing she knew, and the child would need it more than any of the rest, that a person is worth what they carry in their hands and not what they look like from across a feed mill, and that the world will spend a long time looking straight past a quiet soul before it ever thinks to ask what that soul might know, and that the answer to being looked past is never to grow small and never to grow bitter, but only to keep the knowing bright and ready in your hands for the morning the world finally has need of it, because that morning comes. It always comes, and God help the valley that has let its quiet ones go untrained before it does. Juniper lived to be an old cow, the way good cows on well-run farms do, and she gave her milk down easy every evening of her long life into her granddaughter's small bucket, and when at last she grew too old to milk, Nora did not send her to Merrow. She turned her out to live her last years on the spring green hill she had been born under, and the old cow spent her final summers grazing the same pasture her line had grazed for 4 generations, and died at last of nothing but age in the shade of the juniper by the milk-house where a hard frost had first brought her into the world. And Nora buried her on the hill and told her daughter that some cows earn a grave the way some people do, by carrying a whole line forward through the years when everyone else had given up on it. Merritt Vane became, across those years, the farmer he had come home unable to be. not because his back grew stronger, but because he finally learned to listen to the cows and to the grass and to the wife who had taught him both, and he grew into an easy, weathered contentment that the tired, defeated man who had tried to send Nora home in the rain would not have recognized in a mirror. He kept the note his uncle's farm had nearly drowned under, the old bank paper marked paid in full, framed on the wall of the office over the creamery, not out of pride, but out of memory, so that on the hard days, and there were still hard days, because it is farming, and there are always hard days, he could look up at it and remember that the worst thing that ever happened to him, inheriting a dying herd he did not understand, had turned out to be the road to the only life he had ever wanted, and that a man never knows, in the middle of his ruin, which of his disasters is the silt that will one day grow his richest field. There was one more year worth the telling, the 4th year. The year the price of milk fell through the floor across the whole country and took a great many farms down with it, big and small, the kind of year that shows a valley what it is truly made of. The price the distant plants paid for raw milk dropped so low that spring that a farmer lost money on every hundredweight he shipped. And all across the country, the small dairies that had held on through everything else finally let go, and even Curtis Denro's great steel operation down on the flat by Merrow, 2,000 cows milked around the clock, staggered and shed a third of its herd. Because a big farm that only sells raw milk cheap to a plant is just as helpless before a bad price as a small one, only helpless on a larger scale. And Cobble Hollow, that hard year, did not merely survive it. Cobble Hollow came through it stronger, and the reason was the thing Nora had built in the corner of the old creamery 4 years before. Because a valley that turns half its milk into cheese and butter under its own name is not at the mercy of the raw price the way a valley that only ships is. And while the plants were paying starvation money for fluid milk, the co-op's cheese was selling at the same fair price it always had. City people driving up the Wren Creek Road to buy it same as ever. And the money the cheese brought in carried the whole valley across the bad year the way a keel carries a boat across a trough. Nora sat up nights that spring with the co-op's books spread under the lamp, the way she had the first winter, doing for 30-odd farms the arithmetic that would decide whether they held together or came apart, and she made the hard fare calls a bad year demands, held the cheese money in common, shorted no one, and stood up in the church basement again and told the frightened valley the plain truth, that they had been here before, that the world had tried to starve them out once with a letter, and they had answered it by becoming their own creamery, and that the world was trying again now with a low price, and the answer was the same, to hold together and make their own way and trust the thing they had built, and that any farm that wanted to sell out and run to the beef market was free to go but would be going alone, because the co-op was staying. And the valley stayed. Not one farm on the Cobble Hollow Cooperative went under that terrible year, the only stretch of country for 50 miles in any direction that could say so. And when the price at last crawled back up the following spring, the valley came out the far side of it whole and close and prouder than ever, and men in the coffee shops in Merrow who had watched 2,000 of Curtis Denro's cows go to the killers while 30-odd little farms up a creek did not lose a single one, shook their heads and said they did not understand it, and the answer, though they never quite grasped it, was standing in an office over a creamery keeping the books, a heavy-set woman in her late 30s now, with a solemn small daughter at her elbow, who had learned at a dead woman's knee that the milk is only the money and the cow is the farm, and who had spent her whole life being told she was too soft for hard business by men who did not know the first hard. Thing about it, there is an evening that stands for all the evenings, the way there always is on a farm that has come right. It is a warm evening late in the summer some years on, and the milking is done, and the tank is cold and full of the cleanest milk on the route, and the cows are coming up the lane from the hill pasture in their slow patient line with their calves at their sides. And the light is going long and gold across the green meadow that was once a foot of flood silt, and the old creamery down the road has its lights on where 2 young cheesemakers Gustav trained are turning the day's milk into next month's wheels. On the milk-house steps sits Merritt Vane, weathered and easy, mending a halter, and beside him on the worn stone sits his wife. Broad and gray, streaked now and utterly unhurried, and between them on the bottom step sits a solemn, wide little girl with a bucket of her own, and the three of them watch the cows come home. And if you stood at the fence rail that evening, the way the men of the valley had once stood to laugh, you would see the whole of it. You would see Halbert Ames drive by and lift a hand off the wheel, the old man who had taken off his cap in a flooded dawn and never once in the years since let anyone say a word against her. You would see, if you waited, Roy Tibbet's truck turn in, the man who had told the joke at the feed mill and become, in the paying off of that debt, one of the family's truest friends, coming to sit an hour and talk cows the way he had first sat at her table the June morning the bulk truck pulled away full. You would see, on a Sunday, Vesta Prine's car. The banker's wife who had pitied a sad heavy girl over a quilting frame and now would not let the church supper be run by any other hands. You would see a valley that had spent 35 years looking straight past a quiet soul, and had learned, all together and all at once, in one hard, bright year, exactly what it had been failing to see. Nora Halvorsen never made them say it more than once. That was the thing the valley loved her for. In the end, almost more than the herd or the co-op or the cheese, that a woman who had been given every right in the world to gloat had never taken it, that she had answered 35 years of quiet contempt not with a single word of triumph, but only with work so plainly good that the contempt had no place left to stand. That she had let Halbert Ames keep his dignity in the flooded dawn, and let Roy Tibbet make his amends in his own words, and let Vesta Prine come to her door in her own slow time, and had fed every one of them afterward at her own kitchen table with cream. She had learned it from Ada, who had learned it from a harder century than this one, that the only vindication worth the having is the kind that leaves the other person able to sit at your table afterward, and that a woman who wins by making her doubters small has not won anything at all but a lonely house. And so the valley came to her table, all of it, the whole road that had once written her off, and sat down and was fed, and that was the true harvest of the whole long story, larger than any tank of milk, the thing the meta of it had promised from the start and paid off in the end, that what Nora Halvorsen won back on that farm was worth far more than the herd she saved, because what she won back was a whole valley's ability to see, and her own long waiting knowing finally spent, and a table that was never again empty on a Sunday. There was a day, some years on, that the valley made into a kind of quiet holiday without ever quite deciding to. The first Saturday of April, the anniversary of the morning a heavy-set produce clerk had moved into the hired man's cottage with a pass-book and a wooden caddy of tools, and started the whole thing with a bucket and a brush. It was not a fair, and it was not a festival. It was only that the co-op held its yearly meeting that day at the creamery, and afterward the whole valley stayed and ate together the way they had learned to do, and every year the crowd was a little larger, because the young were staying now and having children of their own, and the long tables filled the creamery floor and spilled out into the April sun, and there was cheese. Always cheese. Gustav's own recipe, made by hands he had trained. And there were the pies, and there was the plain, unhurried gladness of a place that had come near to dying and had chosen instead to live. Nora never spoke long at those meetings. She kept the books and read the year's figures in her low, even voice, and sat down and let the young officers of the co-op run the rest of it, because she had learned that the surest way to kill a thing you have built is to hold it too tight, and she meant this valley's living to outlast her by 100 years. But there was one thing she did, quietly, the spring her daughter turned old enough for it, that the valley talked about for a long time after, because they understood, watching it, that they were seeing the whole meaning of the story handed forward in a single small gesture. At the end of the meeting that year, Nora took down from the creamery office wall the wooden caddy of hand tools, Ada's tools, the ones worn smooth as river stones that she had carried into that cottage the first April, and she carried them out into the April sun in front of the whole gathered valley, and she knelt down in front of her solemn wide daughter. and she put the caddy into the child's small hands, and she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, and quiet enough that it was really only for the girl, that these tools had belonged to her mother's grandmother, and that they had milked a herd for 39 years and then waited 4 more in a cottage for a hand that could use them, and then had helped save a valley, and that they were the child's now, not to keep on a shelf but to use, and to teach, and one day to hand down again, because the tools were nothing and the knowing was everything, and the knowing only stayed alive in the world as long as somebody was willing to kneel down in the straw and pass it to somebody small. And the wide, solemn little girl took the caddy of tools in both hands, the way you take something heavy and holy. And the valley was quiet for a moment in the April sun, and then somebody began to clap, and then they all did, a whole valley on its feet clapping in the spring light for a woman who had once been the joke of the feed mill, and was now, plainly and past all argument, the truest thing the place had ever grown. And Nora Halvorsen stood up in the middle of all that clapping, and did not make a speech, and did not weep, and did not gloat, because she never had, and never would. She only rested her broad, steady hand on her daughter's shoulder, and looked out across the tables at Halbert Ames and Roy Tibbet and Vesta Prine and Lowell Prine and Merritt and the whole gathered valley she had carried through the water in the dark. And she thought of a low, even voice in a lantern-lit barn a lifetime ago telling a wide, serious little girl on a bucket that the milk is only thee. Money and the cow is the farm, and she understood that she had spent her whole life proving that one sentence true, in milk and in cheese and in a valley saved and a table never again empty, and that her grandmother, wherever the good dairy hands go when the long milking is finally over, knew it now too. The barn itself came all the way back in those years, and it is worth stopping to see it whole, because the barn had been the first thing Nora loved on that farm, and the last thing to be fully healed. The long, low-stanchion barn of fieldstone and weathered board, the one that had been beautiful and dying both on the gray afternoon she first drove out, stood sound and clean and lit again down every window of its south wall, the row of small square panes going gold at evening milking the way they had when Ada worked there, the manure hauled clean to the field where it belonged, the alleys scraped to bright concrete and bedded deep, the yard graveled and drained so no cow ever stood in mud again, the milkhouse door hung true on new hinges over the old spring trough that had saved a day's milk the summer the cooler. Died. Merritt re-roofed it himself the 3rd year, board by board on the long summer evenings, and painted the trim, and set a new cupola on the peak, and when he was done he stood back in the yard beside his wife and looked at the barn his uncle had left him. The barn he had once hated the smell of and half wished would burn, and he said, quietly, that he thought Emile would know it now, and that he was glad, because a man ought to be able to look down from wherever he has gone and see that the work of his life did not die with him after all. And Nora took her husband's hand in the yard in the evening light and did not say anything, because she had learned across a lifetime that the largest things are best met with a hand and a silence. And the two of them stood there a while and watched the gold go out of the windows one by one as the light failed, the way they would stand 1,000 more evenings, and the plain, shared quiet of a life they had built out of a thing the whole world had called too far gone. There is one more of the early days worth setting down, because it is the day the county vet came around, and a doctor's word carries a weight in a farming valley that a neighbor's does not. His name was Dr. Pell, a sound, careful man who had doctored the valley's stock for 20 years, and he had known the Delcourt herd in its long, slow decline under Merritt. And when Nora first took the farm, he had privately told Halbert Ames, as one professional man will tell another, that he did not expect the arrangement to last the summer, that the woman meant well, but that goodwill did not cure a herd. He came out the 2nd June on a call, a good young cow gone suddenly off her feed and hollow in the flank, and he examined her and could not quite place it, and it was Nora, standing quiet at the cow's head, who said, when he finally asked her plain what she thought, that if he would put his stethoscope high on the left side behind the last rib and flick the hollow with his finger he would hear it. The high hollow ping of a stomach floated up out of place where it did not belong. the twisted gut that had killed one of Merritt's cows the winter before because no one had known to listen for it. Dr. Pell put his stethoscope where she said and flicked the hollow and heard the ping clear as a struck bell, and looked at the heavy-set woman over the cow's back with an expression Nora had seen on a good many faces that spring, the expression of a man rearranging what he thought he knew. He rolled the cow to float the stomach back where it belonged. The field fix Nora had learned at Ada's elbow, and it held, and the cow was eating by evening, and before he packed his bag, Dr. Pell did the thing that mattered, because he was an honest man, and honest men pay their debts in the coin they were run up in. He said in front of Merritt and Gustav that in 20 years of doctoring that valley he had never had a farmer diagnose a displaced stomach for him by ear across a barn, and that he had told people this arrangement would not last the summer, and that he had been a fool, and that from that day forward, if Nora Halvorsen said a cow was sick, he would drive out at any hour without asking a second. Question: because she could read an animal better than he could with all his schooling, having been taught it, he understood, by the best herdswoman the valley ever had. And he was true to his word for the rest of his working life, and told the story himself, against himself, for years, which is the rarest and most generous kind of concession there is. A proud, skilled man telling a room full of people how wrong he had been about a woman they had all been wrong about together. Kindness, Ada had taught her, is not the rescue. Anyone with a strong back and a good heart can pull a calf out of a flood on the one wild night. The whole valley had proved that. Kindness is the thing you do after. In the long ordinary weeks when the danger is gone and the cameras, if there had been cameras, would have left, the staying on that no one claps for. And it was in the staying on that Nora Halvorsen did the truest work of her life. The work the valley never made a holiday of because it happened too quietly and too often to notice. There was a young couple who came back to the valley the 4th year, a Delcourt cousin and his wife, drawn home by the news that Cobble Hollow was a place a person could farm again. And they bought a run-down 40 up the creek on more nerve than money and nearly drowned in their first winter the way beginners do. And it was Nora who drove up their lane in the cold dark, more mornings than anyone. Counted. Not to lecture and not to take over, but to stand in their barn at the young wife's elbow and teach her. One cow and one true thing at a time, exactly the way Ada had taught. The milking order and the water cups and the low even voice, until the young woman had the knowing in her own hands and did not need her any more. And that was the point, that they should not need her any more. Because a kindness that keeps a person dependent is only a softer kind of contempt, and Nora had spent too long being pitied to ever once mistake pity for help. She taught them, and she stepped back, and she let them make their own farm, and when their milk came clean and their tank came full the second spring, she took no credit for it at all, and told the young wife, when she tried to thank her, only to do the same some day for the next frightened family that came up the creek on more nerve than money. Because that was how a valley stayed alive, not by one strong woman saving it once, but by the knowing passing hand to hand down all the years, so that no soul in Cobble Hollow would ever again stand alone in a barn at 3 a.m. with a dying animal and no one who knew how to help. The school reopened its second room the 5th year, for the first time in a generation. Because there were children enough in the valley again to fill it, the children of the young who had stayed and the young who had come back, and on the first morning of it Nora walked her own solemn daughter down the road to that reopened school, past a dozen other farm children walking the same way, and she stood at the schoolyard fence a while after the bell and looked at the full yard and thought that this, more than the ribbon and more than the creamery and more than any tank of milk, was the harvest. A valley with children in it again, a road that had turned back from its own quiet dying, and that if you traced it all the way back it ran to a gray afternoon at a feed mill counter and a heavy-set woman who had turned around from the shelf and asked a question no one thought she had any business asking. That is nearly the whole of it, the story of the big doubted woman and the dying herd and the valley she carried up out of the dark on the strength of a knowing that nobody had ever once thought to want. It is a true kind of story even where the names are not, true to every quiet, overlooked soul who has ever carried more in their two hands than the world would trouble itself to see, and true to the plain, hard, hopeful trade of dairying, where the milk is only the money, and the cow is the farm, and the morning always comes, in the end, when the world has need of exactly what you are. And if you are the kind of soul who has read this far because some part of it sounded like your own life, because you too have carried a knowing in your hands that the world never once thought to ask you for, then hear the one thing Nora would want said to you before we go. The morning comes. It came for a heavy-set produce clerk at a feed mill counter after 35 years of being looked past, and it came late, and it came all at once, and it will come for you, and the only work that is truly yours in the meantime is to keep the knowing bright and ready, unbitter and unbent, so that when the world finally has need of exactly what you are, your hands are steady and your heart is still soft enough to answer. That was Ada's whole gospel, passed down a lifetime from a lantern-lit barn, and it is the truest thing this channel knows how to give you, and it is yours now to carry and to keep, and one day, when some quiet, overlooked soul beside you is standing in the dark of their own long waiting, to hand gently on. So there she is, if you want to carry her home with you tonight, a heavy-set, gray-streaked woman in her middle years, standing at a schoolyard fence in the morning light in a valley that a creamery's letter and a corporate buyer and a night flood and a killing price could none of them put under. A woman the whole county once called too soft for hard business, standing now at the center of everything that Valley had left to be proud of, and never once, in all the years of her vindication, raising her voice to say so. I hope she stays with you a while, the way she has stayed with me. And if she has moved you, then, before you go, do two small things for me. Sit for a moment with the part of Nora's story that landed hardest on your own heart. Because everyone who hears this carries a different piece of it home, and I have come to believe the piece you carry says something true about you. So here is what I want you to weigh, and I mean weigh it, not answer it quick and scroll on. When you think back over this whole long year on Wren Creek, which was the truer victory? Was it the night in the black water, the raw, impossible strength of a doubted woman wading chest deep into a flood to carry out the calves that no man there would have gone in after? Or was it the quiet mornings after, all the unclapped for mornings, when she drove up a young couple's lane in the cold dark to teach them the knowing, and then stepped back and let them stand on their own? The wild rescue, or the long staying on? There is no wrong answer, only your answer, and I would truly like to read it, so tell me down in the comments which one you would carry home. And tell me why, because the why is always the part I read twice. And while you are down there, do the other thing. Tell me the name of your town, your valley, your county. Wherever in this wide world you are sitting listening to a story about cows and cheese and a woman who would not quit. Because I dearly love to see how far up the creek and across the oceans Nora's story travels. And every single pin on that map is a person who understands, the way she did, what it is to carry more than anyone ever thought to ask you for. Next time, I want to take you 2 farms up the same Wren Creek Road to that young couple who came home on more nerve than money and tell you the story of the winter they very nearly lost it all, and the neighbor who would not let them. Because there are more stories on this road than one, and a valley that comes back to life has 100 of them, and I mean to tell you every one if you will keep me company. So subscribe if you have not, and stay, and drop your town below, and come back up the creek with me next time. As for tonight, we will leave them where they belong. It is evening on the Delcourt farm, the good clean barn lit gold down every window of its long south wall, and the milking is done, and the tank is cold and full, and a broad quiet woman and a weathered easy man sit close together on the milk-house steps in the last of the light with a solemn small girl between them, and they do not say anything at all, because everything worth saying has long since been said in the plain shared work of the days. And up the lane, slow and patient in the failing gold, the cows come home.